Let's talk about U.S. sanctions on Iran, because the U.S. president keeps piling them on.
Powerful sanctions will go into full effect.
But Iran isn't bowing.
دارن دشمنی میکنن. بدانند این دشمنی اونها بی جواب نخواهد ماند.
Now, according to this online tracker, America has more sanctions against Iran than it does on North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and Libya combined. So what exactly are those sanctions? And more importantly, are they working? The big picture is this. The US and Iran are in a way at war.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
But they don't fight face to face. Instead, they antagonize each other. Iran gets involved in conflicts around the Middle East by backing armed groups and US rivals like Russia. And the US's main weapon? Sanctions. Now, the simple definition of a sanction is an official order taken against a country in order to make it obey international law. That could include bans on travel, transactions, or trade. And in Iran's case, it's all of those.
Any kind of exchange that directly or indirectly might benefit the Iranian government or any agency of it or any individual who may directly or indirectly be affiliated with it is prohibited under American law.
Now, we've read the US Treasury's blacklist for Iran, and it is long. The big ones are a ban on Iran's biggest industry, which is oil, and a ban on any kind of financial transactions with Iran. Plus, its entire steel, mining, coal sectors, dozens of individual people and ministries in Iran's government, banks, insurance, construction companies, ships, and aircraft. There's even a ban on Persian carpets, one of Iran's biggest exports, and its pistachio industry. Now, the penalties for violating those sanctions are serious. The US government can fine a person or company up to $1 million or hand down a 20-year jail sentence, even if they're not American.
Because the U.S. has such a strong dollar and so many transactions are conducted in dollars, it means that U.S. sanctions would affect any EU company doing business with Iran.
Between having sanctions on its main industries and being blocked from trading with other countries, Iran has become one of the most isolated economies in the world. So when did this sanctions war start? More than 40 years ago. The US long supported Iran's monarch, the Shah. But in 1979, the Islamic Revolution swept cleric Ayatollah Khamenei to power. A group of Iranian revolutionaries stormed the US embassy and imprisoned its staff for over a year. That led to the very first round of sanctions on Iran, with the US freezing billions of dollars in Iranian government assets. And it was just the beginning. Over the next several decades, Iran came under more international sanctions over human rights abuses. Iran was also sanctioned for sending billions of dollars to armed groups in the Middle East, like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Palestine. But it was Iran's decision to develop nuclear power that really got the US worried, because Iran now had the tools to build a nuclear bomb.
Since 2003, a nuclear crisis has been brewing between Iran, the United States, and its European allies when it was revealed that Iran has 2 nuclear facilities that it did not declare to the IAEA.
So in 2011, the US, together with the UN, issued a massive heap of economic sanctions on Iran to A, stop any money flowing to its nuclear program, and B, to pressure Iran into potentially striking a diplomatic deal. And that part worked. In 2015, after long and tough negotiations, a deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed.
A historic deal.
The landmark nuclear agreement will mean that Iran has to sharply curtail its nuclear program.
The Iranian foreign minister receives a hero's welcome back in Tehran. International sanctions against Iran will now be lifted.
We've achieved this historic progress through diplomacy, without resorting to another war in the Middle East.
But the truth is that many US lawmakers, Republicans in particular, didn't trust Iran would keep its end of the deal. Neither did one of America's closest allies.
Iran's rulers promised to destroy my country, murder my people. Perhaps you can understand why Israel is not joining you in celebrating this deal.
So as soon as Donald Trump became president, he backed out.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
All the old sanctions came back, and more than 700 new ones were issued against Iranian individuals and companies. It's what the Trump administration calls its maximum pressure campaign. So when people ask, how's the US sanctions program worked on Iran? Well, that's debatable. These new sanctions have nearly killed the entire Iran nuclear deal. And in response, the Iranians have said, well, what's the point of us holding up our end? So they've now restarted some low-level nuclear activity.
And they will probably continue to do so until the EU takes action to deliver on some of their economic commitments, which they're not able to deliver because of US pressure. The eventual outcome could be an Iran withdrawal from the nuclear accord and also the death of the whole deal.
Sanctions have managed to cripple Iran's economy, but Iranians are getting around them.
Human mules have carried smuggled goods across the border for years. Electronics, phones, beauty products, medicine, cigarettes. The list goes on.
The long years of sanctions have led the Iranians to develop many of their own domestic products inside that have substituted for those things that they can't bring in. But when sanctions come, there's a dip, and then somehow the economy starts reacting and responding and compensating, and within 3 or 4 years, it's back to growth.
Another question is whether Iran's government can survive many more years of instability. Don't get me wrong, it still has a lot of support, but recent protests across Iranian cities have exposed some discontent with those in power.
Anger, frustration, and growing concern in Tehran.
The protests erupted after Iran's government, which has been strapped for cash, increased the price of fuel to raise funds. In November, thousands of people were arrested. Rights groups say more than 300 were killed. And at one point, there was a total internet shutdown. Iran's leaders say they were responding to a bigger threat.
آشوب طلبان سازمان یافته مسلح برنامه ریزی شده و کاملا بر مبنای برنامه‌ای که ارتجاع منطقه صهیونیست‌ها و آمریکایی‌ها طراحی کرده بودند.
The bottom line is, it's not clear whether the US's huge web of sanctions is going to lead to any kind of breakthrough with Iran. And there's a whole debate about whether those pressure tactics have ever forced any big changes in places like Cuba or North Korea, where sanctions have been around for decades. Those who defend sanctions say the alternative is an actual war. But neither the US, nor Iran, nor anybody else seem to want that. If there's a story or a topic you want to get your head around, let us know. Get in touch with us on Twitter or Facebook, and remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode.